Welcome into the 9 essential tips to get your chess to the next level and to separate yourself from the crowd. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and let's start with this position. It is white to play. Black has just moved their queen to g4, attacking your pawn. How would you play here as white? Most players, when faced with a threat like that, would simply castle, trying to defend that pawn. And there's nothing wrong with that move. However, it misses an opportunity to potentially win the game on the spot. And which brings us to the first idea. Take advantage of a misplaced piece. Now, if we look closer at this position, you can realize that this queen on g4 is actually misplaced. Typically, it is not advised to develop your queen too early in the game because it can become attacked by your opponent. And therefore, instead of just trying to defend against it, you may ask yourself, how can I attack it? How can I take advantage of this exposed position of the queen? And let's try it out. So what if you attack it with h3? Initially, it looks bad because he can grab the pawn and attack your rook. But we know that the point is actually to keep attacking that queen and potentially to capture it. Do you see the way to do that? There's a move rook to g1, which is not a bad idea. However, in that case, the queen could capture the pawn. On the other hand, if you move the rook right here, then now the queen is just trapped and you're winning the game. It is very common for your opponents to pin your knights like that. That probably happens in every other game that you play. How do you respond to that? Most chess players automatically interpose their bishop, and that is almost an automatic, unthinking reaction to a pin like that. However, if you notice, in the games of grandmasters, they very rarely, if ever, play a move like that. For grandmasters, this is literally the last resort, if there is absolutely nothing better, which is rarely the case. And what I suggest you to do is to counter it more aggressively. And one of my favorite techniques is called zigzag. We're using the drawback of your opponent's plan. Since the bishop went to the king side, this also simultaneously means that his queen side is now less defended, and we want to make use of that. So initially you strike there, hit in the center, and once the pawn is protected, you then shift your queen to the queen side, taking advantage of that exact weakness. Notice that with the bishop standing right there on c8, if we imagine the bishop being there, the pawn on b7 would be defended. But it's no longer the case since the bishop went out, and now this pawn is hanging so as indirectly would also threaten the rook. And of course, black can easily prevent this from happening. However, now all these light squares on the queen side are weak, so was the king, and also there is no pin on your knight anymore because you quite smartly remove the queen with a tempo, and now your knight is free to go. You can jump forward, and now your knight is taking that revenge on the bishop. Now we flip the script, and now the knight is attacking the bishop, not the other way around. Once the bishop moves, you can now keep taking advantage of all those weaknesses of light squares on the queen side, and initially you clear the diagonal for your bishop, and then you bring it out with a check. Now he can't cover the pawn because of your knight and bishop control this square, so knight d7 feels fine for black, and now they only need a couple moves to complete their development and to feel fine. However, you play the move that Fischer announced as best by test, pawn to e4. The thing is, he's barely holding the position, and you just need one more attack to completely overpower black. And the funniest line here is if black simply captures it, there is almost scholar's checkmate, which comes as a big surprise. And other than that, if black captures it with, let's say, a bishop, then after bishop g5, that's another pretty cool revenge. You countered his pin attempt by a double pin. In this case, this knight is pinned, and the other knight is pinned as well. And therefore, after whatever they do, you can just take this knight, and you're winning. This time, it's white to move as well. And how would you play here? Looks like a more or less normal opening situation, and of course you can stick to your plan and just develop pieces. You can castle or maybe develop your knight, and these are perfectly fine and normal moves. However, there is a way to make it way more efficient. Here's the deal. You need to examine your opponent's moves, and if you notice that he or she does something awkward, that should trigger you to be on the lookout for attacking opportunities so that you can punish your opponent's mistakes. And in this case, we can see that black indeed played an opening in a somewhat awkward fashion. Now, the knight from g8 was not yet developed. This knight on d7 is blocking out the queen and the bishop. It's kind of standing in the way. The other bishop was not developed to a normal, square, such as in the Italian game. So all that construction is kind of awkward. And that gives you an idea that you might try to play more aggressively to take advantage of your opponent's inaccuracies. And how do you do that? You ask yourself, how do I go forward and create threats? And with that question in mind, you can find the move queen d5, which creates checkmate and threat. and black has no way to counter that besides just giving up material and losing the game anyway. This also illustrates how easy to separate yourself from the crowd. In this position, only 9% of players found the correct move for white here. Can you see it? Black has just played another pretty weird move, pawn to f6. Now that is clearly wrong. That does not develop a piece, that weakens the king unnecessarily, and is just bad from every possible perspective. How do you take advantage of that? As usual, you need to focus your attention on opponent's side of the board and ask yourself, how do I go forward and create threats? And the way to go is knight takes c5, a temporary sacrifice which enables your queen to then jump out with a check and transition into a direct attack. And if black blocks the check, then queen takes e5 comes with a double attack. Now you're going to win this rook in the corner, and black is totally destroyed. In the next example, I'm going to challenge you to try to find a move that a grandmaster couldn't find. In this case, it is black to play, and in the game, black just traded off everything on e4, transitioning into an endgame. However, there was a better move for black to play. And here's the rule: don't just move, hunt for weaknesses. And the next logical question is, what are those weaknesses? Well, in this case, we need to focus our attention on opponent's side of the board, mainly on these two ranks, just because the home rank, the second rank, is typically well covered by his pawns, but these two are on opponent's side of the board, and yet they're accessible for your pieces typically. And you're going to look for pawns and squares which are not protected by pawns. All right, and in this case, there's plenty of them. Literally almost everything is not protected by pawns. And especially we gotta see a bunch of those light squares on the king side. Since the g-pawn moved, all these squares became weak, and so are these two knights, which are kind of loose. And when you're on the lookout for weaknesses, it just gives you those new ideas, and automatic ideas almost, to take advantage of them somehow. And in this case, it would be really great if we could capture one of these knights, but the issue is the queen from e2 guards them, which might give you an idea that you may wish to deflect it by going rook to c2. Sacrifice your rook, but now this knight is no longer defended. You can capture it with a check, forcing the king to move, and now all these light squares around the king are dead weak, and you can just play bishop h3 and finish the game on the next move. In the next example, white played queen to d3, setting up this battery against the black king. And in such positions, it's very natural to automatically try to block the diagonal and defend by going pawn to g6. The issue with that move is it is so automatic that we simply forget to ask ourselves if there is anything better. And more importantly, the tip is, before defending, ask yourself if there is a way to counterattack. And very often there is. So here g6 just creates a bunch of weaknesses that your opponent can use, kind of like we talked about before. And for instance, he can capture, continue with a knight to d7, and you're forked. Instead, let's come back and ask ourselves, can we counterattack? And now you can notice that, okay, can potentially capture this knight, or maybe I can go forward right here with the counter to his queen and bishop, and now the queen will have to go, then you can take the bishop and you eliminated the threat easily without doing anything defensive. Which also brings us to the next idea. Since we now know that queen to d3 is actually not very effective for white, what should white play instead? There's a very strong concept called a Pillsbury knight. With this knight on e5, and it's supported by those two pawns, it often gives white a winning advantage. And it's interesting that Stockfish kinda is not very impressed with the idea, but I've noticed from my own experience that whenever I get to this structure, like, it 90% guarantees your victory. It's just so hard for black to do anything against that. Your knight in the middle of the board is just so dominant, controlling so many squares around, and black never really wants to take it, because if he ever captures the knight, that opens up the file for your rook. Now this bishop's pressure is very strong, the knight is attacked, and you just have so huge attack after that with all these pieces moving forward, and this pawn is also attacking some additional squares. Therefore, he doesn't really want to take it, but he can't really tolerate it anyways, and so black is completely stuck. By the way, talking about the Harry Pillsbury, he was a very interesting person. One of the top players at the time, he was also known for his great blindfold skills. He would play checkers and chess simultaneously while playing a hand of whist and reciting a list of long words. Oh my god, and here we are, trying to recall where we put our keys. Bottom line, the Pillsbury knight is just as monstrous as the guy was himself. In the next position, it is white to move, and you might have heard about the idea of forcing moves, which are checks, captures, and threats. I call it a CCTV camera idea, so you're kind of like on the lookout for those attacking opportunities. And here's the deal. A lot of players have heard about it but have a hard time using it in their own games, because you can't be sitting there and thinking at every turn about all these moves, you'll simply run out of time. So how do you actually implement this in your own games? The thing is, that algorithm of thinking, CCT, right, is triggered by your opponent's weak king and the fact that you're trying to attack. Only that, it really makes sense for you to be on the lookout for those opportunities. And here the king is weak. You've got a lot of pieces pointing towards the king, literally every piece that you have. And those two factors combined is a clear indicator that you should be on the lookout for chess captures and threats. And this may help you to find a paradoxical move like this, sacrificing your queen, but forcing the king to come back and finishing the game. There's a well-known idea that you should develop your pieces in an opening. However, in some situations it can be misleading. Think about this situation for a second. If you just want to develop pieces, then the moves that come to your mind might be something like bishop e7, maybe castle, develop your knight. And while they're not losing the game on the spot, they're just very passive, like you're crawling on the last few ranks and hardly put any pressure onto your opponent. And what is the issue really? The issue is there are these pawns that block your pieces, and also there are your opponent's pawns which are controlling a lot of squares, not letting you move your pieces out and literally develop them to active squares. Which brings us to the next idea. Use pawn breaks to activate your pieces. If there are all these pawns which are annoying you, not letting you move forward and develop your pieces actively, you can start attacking them with a move like this or like this. And here c5 challenges the center. If white captures, great. Now you can already develop your bishop to this square, which you couldn't do before, and from here it's going to be very active. If instead white tries to hold on to his center, you can put even more pressure, and if white still tries to hold on after this trade, that already gives you some more squares for your pieces. Nice. Some file for your rook in the future. Nice. Plus you can keep using the same idea, using pawn breaks, to eliminate this pawn, which also cramps your position. And after this trade, now your pieces are absolutely fine, like both knights are active and you can easily complete your development, and now your position is way more active. And of course, it is a universal idea applicable not only to the French defense, but to any chess game that you play. In situations like that, so often I see players play a move like this, just trying to, keep it nice and solid. And while it looks nice and well protected at first, in reality it's quite dull. Like this bishop is not going anywhere, right? He's hitting the wall, he can't go forward at all. This bishop is now also totally stuck and cannot be activated, and therefore white is clearly going downhill. And within just a couple moves, white will find himself in a totally lost position where black will keep expanding and going forward, and white will be completely stuck right here and on the last two ranks, not knowing what to do. So what is the solution? Just follow that principle. Use pawn breaks to activate your pieces. If there is this annoying pawn which blocks the bishop, which doesn't let your knight to come back to the normal position, you gotta undermine it, and then once the pawn is traded off, now just look at this. Your knight is active, you can go forward, your bishop can be developed easily, the other bishop is active, the rook is active, and life is beautiful. In this position, white's very common move is knight to d2, trying to get rid of black's active knight from e4. However, when you know Kasparov's rule, it becomes clear to you that this is a big mistake. And Kasparov's rule simply states that you need to outnumber your opponent on the king side. Since you're going to checkmate the king, and the next question that logically comes to your mind is, what would need to happen for you to checkmate the king? Well, you need to outnumber your opponent on the king side. And in this case, if you look at this position from that perspective and you simply focus your attention on the king side and you try to see how many pieces are there, you will notice that most of white's pieces, pretty much all of them, besides this rook, is on the queen side. Therefore, the king side, the king himself, is actually undefended. And therefore, instead of trading knights or even reacting to this threat, black chose to just go hard on his own attack on the king side, preparing to bring the queen out and forming a battery. And even though white tried to stop it, black said, no way, I'm going to keep going there. Queen h4, sacrificing the queen, which looks completely sudden at first, but it makes total sense if you are aware of that Kasparov's rule. And if you want to know all the essential rules about opening, middle game, end game, and also I recorded myself playing and showing exactly how to utilize these moves while playing chess, you can get it from my course. I'll drop the link down below if you're curious. And either way, have a great rest of the day.